Yeah, thank you. I would like to make a discussion in terms of Serubiri, Obura, and the question of Okello. Will President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni truly sign another death warrant? And I would argue that in terms of a comparative legal but also political analysis in terms of capital punishments in Uganda. And obviously, I'm going to make specific inference to those cases because we know that ever since His Excellency came in power, those are the two people who have been, you know, culpable for the death warrant in the context of his terms of office, as we probably know by now. But now we are facing another challenge, perhaps one that is strongly supported by public in the context of what transpired. But the question is whether President Yoweri Museveni is ready to do that. So Ugandans obviously are asking a difficult and uncomfortable but entirely legitimate question, whether or not Christopher Okello Onyum has actually been sentenced to death for the brutal murder of 4 infants, but will he actually be executed? Not a good topic, not so obviously from any side in the question of that challenge. But the question sounds simple, and legally it is not, because in Uganda there is a major constitutional distinction many people misunderstand. In the context of a judge may actually sentence you to death, but only the president decides whether that death does actually happen. And so the question then becomes that distinction is at the heart of my discussion. So this is not merely a criminal law issue. No. It is a constitutional question as well. Perhaps also a political question and more also a philosophical question. And so we will try to go through these issues and shed light and create the fact that it's very, very important, and a question about power. So we will examine the executions of Haji Musa, Serubimbi and Kasim Obura in 1999, compare them with Christopher Okello Onyum in 2026, and ask one central question: will President Museveni truly sign another death warrant? Does he have the strength, the moral strength, perhaps? I don't want to use other words that will describe otherwise, but we all understand what is before him. So the difference between the sentence and the execution is perhaps what I would like to argue here in the context of this individual, but making a comparative analysis. So many Ugandans obviously will believe that once the court has pronounced a death sentence, then the execution automatically follows. But then that is legally false, because the death sentence is judicial, yes, no doubt about that. But then the execution is presidential, and that's the aspect that we have here. So under Article 121 of the Constitution of Uganda, the president holds what is called a prerogative of mercy. And this means that the president may, for example, may pardon. Yes. Also the instances, for example, where the president may suspend. Yes. In light of that, but also the instances when the president may commute. Yes. And also the instances when the president may reduce. Fundamental powers here given to this individual, the fountain of honor, and also the instances where the president may permit the execution. And so even, for example, after the Supreme Court has actually spoken, yes, the final decision in most cases, as I said, belongs to the State House. So this means fundamentally that certain things must be followed. So the judge writes the sentence and the president writes the obituary. Yes? So this is the true architecture of capital punishment in Uganda. And this is something that we have to be very conversant with as well in terms of the dispensation of criminal procedure law in this context. In my second part, in terms of the discussion that I'm presenting tonight, I will look at the question of the Susan Chigula principle. The Susan Chigula principle. We are probably aware of what transpired in that case, the death penalty case as people know it. The issue was examined in the landmark case of Susan, Attorney General versus Susan Chigula and 417 others. And the Supreme Court made two major rulings. And the first ruling was in the context of that the death penalty itself is unconstitutional. And second was to the effect that keeping someone on death row for too long without execution may become unconstitutional. Why was that important? Because prolonged waiting for death becomes psychological torture in one way or the other. And it may actually violate Article 24 of the Constitution against cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And so the state must eventually decide either to execute, yes, or commute. Fundamentally important. So indefinite uncertainty is itself a punishment, as understood in this context. And sometimes it is the cruelest punishment of all. We probably have been in a little bit of those things. When you don't know your fate, you are there. Perhaps you know, but you're like, when is it coming? It becomes a very uncomfortable position. So that's what the courts are looking at in that context. In my part three, my argument would be in light of Sebirumbi and Obura, why they were executed in the context of the NRM regime, if I use that word. So let us return to 1999 in the context of our discussion tonight. Uganda carried out one of its last major civilian execution at Luzira prison during that time. And among those hanged were people like Haji Musa Sebirumbi, and the other gentleman was Kasim Obura. And we will try to go through and try to see the nexus, the connection between those particular cases and the one of Okello. So, but these were not ordinary executions. Perhaps that is also important for us to understand. These were political executions wrapped in legal clothing, and I will make the dispensation in terms of the discussion. Political in quotes, but also in terms of how they played around and how they were played around in terms of causing the final demise of these individuals. When you look at, for example, Haji Musa Sebirumbi was associated with the UPC era and the violence of the Luweero Triangle during Obote II, if you remember. And he was actually linked to one of the darkest periods in Uganda's political memory, to use that word. So his victims were associated with NRM struggle in a way, and this made the case bigger than murder. Okay, it made the case much bigger than murder. It became a historical closure in a way, and therefore the President Museveni reportedly said, among other things, that wherever he sent his victims, he should actually go. I said allegedly in the context of that, and so this statement tells us everything in a way, in the context of Sebirumbi. Sebirumbi was not executed simply because he was actually guilty, perhaps, but in the context of the political atmosphere that had ensued in that context. So he was executed because his death completed a political story in one way or the other. And so that is something also you may want to look at in the contextualization of this philosophical debate for purposes of sound jurisprudence for us today. When you look at the case of Kasim Obura in the context of his demise, Obura symbolized something which was similar in a way, in the context of some aspects of similarity. he represented the coercive security architecture of Ugandan's violent past, and his execution was not merely punishment. Yeah, it was not merely punishment, it was a regime purification of sorts. And why is this important? The message was clear in the context of what transpired, and these are very strong points in the context of that. The order must die, so a new order must actually live, in terms of philosophical argument here. So this was not ordinary criminal justice, it was also a question of political symbolism of sorts, in terms of the challenge that had ensued. So execution becomes therefore a theater of legitimacy in the context of that, in terms of the issue that had actually transpired. Perhaps that paints a better picture in terms of why no other executions may actually have taken place in the context of the NRM regime, if you like. And then, in light of my part 4, I would like to argue why then the 1999 mattered. Why did it matter in the context of jurisprudential philosophy in terms of this? I would argue that these were executions. They were concentrated particularly in 1999 because the timing in this particular aspect did matter. Politics was actually shifting in one way or the other. Yeah, the government needed to project strength in terms of the red zones, and the movement system was under pressure in the context of also trying to perhaps redress some misfortunes. So the questions about term limits were also beginning, and then the northern insurgency was also continuing in a way. So the state needed a symbolic force in terms of a play out, and I think that also plays into philosophical discussion tonight in terms of. So the execution therefore becomes a political communication of sorts, and the rope was legal. The rope therefore became legal in the context, but the message was political in the question of a discussion, again, for purposes of this analysis. So those are fundamentals in light of trying to contextualize what transpired then, 1999, and perhaps if you want to link it up to the present issue of Okello. Now, in my part 5, my argument would be in terms of the de facto moratorium between 1999 to 2026. What happened? What transpired there? How do we analyze? How do we address? One thing we need to comprehend is that since 1999, Uganda has not carried out civilian executions, and this is something that is extremely important. This is 27 years down the road, not so. And so this is what scholars call a de facto moratorium in a way. And therefore the death penalty does still exist, there's no doubt about that. But courts still sentence people to death. Yes, we have evidence that. But executions in most cases do not happen. And perhaps that's another thing that we need. And therefore, this is not abolition in one way or the other. It is actually a suspended possibility, if you like, a suspended possibility, if you have to argue it that way. And the rope still does exist, there's no doubt about that, in the context of what the law is, but it remains unused. And we have seen that in the context of the time that has actually spanned. And sometimes also important to note is the question of the unused rope is more powerful than a used one, so maybe that was a question of that had to be painted on the pictures very well, that by the way, the unused rope is actually more powerful than a used one. So that is fundamental also philosophically important for us to comprehend in terms of the constitutional jurisprudential philosophical analysis that transpired as well, always transpiring. Then in terms of my part 6, I would argue in terms of Christopher Okello as a different kind of condemned man as it stands today in the context of what has transpired between the 1999 vis-a-vis 2026. Although there could also be painted similarities in one way or the other, I will probably make that the dispensation as well. When you look at Christopher Okello or Onyum and why they become different from Sebirumbi and also from Obura, then you know exactly perhaps where the president's mind may go, and I'm using the word may, although he's the one who said let's have the community trial case. Yeah, he is not politically symbolic in the same historical sense, and he does not represent Obote in any way perhaps, he does not represent Idi Amin in any way perhaps, And he does not even represent a defeated regime. Yes, so those are things that we may want to look at. He is also not a revolutionary memory. He's not a revolutionary memory at all, you know. And he is also a modern criminal convict, perhaps, you know. And so these are issues that are a little bit different in the context of how he stands today. His crime is horrific, yes, terrible, grotesque, perhaps. But the killing, especially in light of the killing of the 4 infants, God bless their souls, this created a moral outrage. No doubt, we were overwhelmed. We were all disturbed to the core. But this is not historical symbolism. Yes, and that distinction matters greatly, and that is something very, very fundamental in terms of the discussion. So, because President Museveni's history shows these executions are rarely about guilty alone. They are rarely about guilt alone. Yeah, they are about what the death means politically. Remember that. And so the real question, therefore, becomes, in the context of the discussion that we're having tonight, what political story does hanging Okello tell? Can we understand that? So this is where his fate will actually be decided in the context of the analysis that we're painting here. So every step in terms of the past, the present, the future is important. In my argument for part 7, which has to do why Okello may, and I'm using the word may, not be executed, is in the following context. It is important for us to understand there are strong reasons why he may not or even never be hanged in the context of that true aspect of hanging, because of the following philosophical reasons. Number one, the moratorium is strong. 27 years is not a small thing. It creates a political habit. Breaking that silence would trigger major attention. Governments become prisoners of their own conventions. That is important for you to understand. So, the longer executions stop, the harder it becomes to restart them. Fundamental in the question of Christopher Okello Onyum. Because a new president may have taken root. So the second is the question of the international pressure. Executions today are not private domestic events. They are international political events. This is something also important. So, for example, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the European Union, the global human bodies would immediately respond, as we already seen perhaps. We've seen it heavily on the media, for example, almost in the world. So these executions do attract diplomatic condemnations in one way or the other, especially if they are loopholes. You know, they also have issues to do with donor scrutiny, then issues with legal criticism, as we're already seeing. Things with reputational costs also, as we're already seeing. All these play into the big game. They play into the big game. So sometimes one hanging costs may actually cost 10 diplomatic negotiations. So President Museveni understands this arithmetic. Purely, very brilliant gentleman. Very brilliant individual. So he knows. He knows the cost and effect. He knows. Now, thirdly, mercy can be moved powerful than death. This perhaps is the deepest point. Execution ends power. Yes, mercy extends it. I know what is in people's hearts, including mine. Can you extend mercy to such an individual? You see, a living person on death row remains a permanent reminder that the president controls life and death. A dead prisoner becomes history. Sometimes mercy is not compassion. Sometimes mercy is superior power. Ask Napoleon Bonaparte. He said that there's a woman who came and said, release, forgive my son. He was listed as a table guy. And Napoleon said, why should I? He said, because he deserves mercy. He says, only you can grant mercy. Mercy. So why Okello may still be executed has also a number of issues relating. But let us not be naive. No. There are also strong reasons why execution may actually happen. Yes? And this is also fundamental, important in terms of the philosophical jurisprudence that I'm painting here, in light of the issue that the nation is facing. First of all, the aspect of public outrage. We know public outrage. The victims were infants, toddlers, young, innocent souls. The place was a daycare center. Who wouldn't want to protect them? Angels perhaps are there. The method was brutal, diabolical, cruel, wicked. This creates extraordinary moral panic. Yes? So when a society demands blood loudly enough, the state may decide blood in politically necessary circumstances. And this is the dilemma. This is the challenge. Now, another aspect that is important to note is the question of deterrence politics. President Yoweri Museveni has repeatedly argued that some offenders deserve to be killed. Not so. So he sees execution as a deterrence. A single hanging can actually be used to restore fear in the criminal imagination. So Okello is notoriously enough to become that example. And that is why I'm saying there's a possibility in that context as well. And also important as the third aspect, the mobile court issue. This was not an ordinary trial. No way. It was a mobile court, yes. And because of that, it happened at the scene of the crime. We're all evident, aware about that, with public screens, okay? With national visibility. We saw it happening left, right, and center. Such trials are political statements. They are political statements. Sometimes governments feel compelled to complete the symbolism with execution. Otherwise, the death sentence looks like a theater without conclusion. So that again is also important to comprehend philosophically. Another aspect in terms of the fourth issue, the election year psychology comes into play. 2026 was the election year, not so. And so during this election, punishment often becomes political language in the context of who is doing what. So execution can actually become a campaigning message in the context of that. Although the results are out, government is protecting your children. In such moments, protecting the gains, like we said, and therefore we have to consolidate the gains. Anything that affects our gains is intolerable. So law becomes electoral in a theater, in a context. So that possibility cannot be ignored as well. Excuse me. So, in light of these arguments, there is a big possibility that the court will be challenged in the context of an appeal perhaps, but fundamentally, the bigger question would be in terms of whether His Excellency is willing to put his hand on the paper by way of signing a death warrant. That is very fundamental. I will be concluding in the next 1 minute, but for takeaway. If Okello, for example, becomes politically symbolic enough, then he will be executed. If he remains only a criminal convict, then he may join hundreds of others on death row for decades. That is important for us to understand. Because, as I just argued, for the case of Uganda, many are sentenced, no doubt about that. Few have actually been executed in the context of that. And so we know by drawing and analyzing the patterns, and politics chooses the neck. Politics chooses the neck. So this is the uncomfortable truth in light of the challenge that this individual may be facing vis-a-vis the decision of the president to take a decision. My final and conclusive philosophical reflection in terms of the arguments that we're having here is as follows. I would like to continue by analyzing and saying there is an old African proverb. The lion does not kill every antelope. Sometimes the fear of the lion is enough. President Museveni understands this. Fundamentally, sometimes the signature matters more than the hanging. Sometimes the gallows are strongest when unused. So the possibility of death disciplines society more than death itself. So the true question is not simply, will Okello be hanged? The deeper question, in light of the discussion, would be, does this death serve power? Because in Uganda, fundamentally, that is often where the real law begins. I thank you, and God bless you. Thank you for listening.